Doorkickers 2 Task Force North recently released into its full 1.0 version, and as a player who's followed it for a while but waited until now to jump in, I can tell you there's some things that I wish I would have known sooner. This video is here for my fellow beginners to give you some tips and address some of the things that I see a lot of new players ask or talk about, and maybe even save you just a little bit of time on the learning curve. For starters is something that you're probably going to hear a lot of people say, but it really is an absolute must. Go into your settings menu and set it so that you have colored paths. Now you can set this up so that individual classes have paths, like all of your assault will have the same color, all of your marksmen will have the same color, or you can set it up so each individual soldier has their own color, which is my personal preference. This really just makes the spaghetti and planning so much more organized and easier to select, direct, and move your soldiers, because inevitably you're going to have stacked teams or crossing paths, and when they're all just this gray color, it is so easy to accidentally select the wrong one, move the wrong path, then you gotta go back and delete and all this other stuff. So for your mental health, absolutely enable this right away. And speaking of your plans, that is tip number 2. Your best laid plans will go bad, especially when you're learning. Things happen very fast, and as soon as you hit that go button, you need to be ready to pause if needed and issue new orders to your squad. You can play these levels through in full real time if you want, but it is definitely more challenging in my opinion. So utilize that real time with pause, and don't be afraid to think out your movements and plans. Take your time. Understand that this is not a Call of Duty tactical game, and you will not just be eating bullets while you're running and gunning everyone down with your troopers. Also, there is an element of RNG in this game, which means that the same plan will not always bring you the same results. Some situations and enemies will be fluid, and timing might not necessarily always be the same. And please read the briefings. Sometimes they are just backstory and filler, but a lot of times they have meaningful tips and things about the mission that you need to know before progressing. Next, if you played Doorkickers 2 in early access or you're just jumping in, it doesn't matter. The full version 1.0 reset everything for everyone. So anything that you might have unlocked in early access is back to 0. This is important for new and returning players because they did add campaigns into the full version, but you have to complete a certain number of missions before you can access them. And while you can and should play through the FNGs welcome category missions to start with, they're kind of like a tutorial. They talk about a lot of the basic mechanics and things like that, and I suggest you do them, but you should also know that the Steam Workshop user-created missions also count towards these unlock goals. And there's actually 2 advantages to this Steam Workshop thing. Number 1, some of the FNG's welcome missions are a little bit tougher and you might get stuck on them. The timed broadcast one, for example, was one that took me forever to figure out how to beat. And it is a relatively small map pool, so being able to go to the Steam Workshop maps is just a good way to open up the game and get a change of pace before you've unlocked all the other categories of missions and the campaign. There's even a random mission generator tool at the very bottom of this list that's very easy to miss if you don't want to deal with the Steam Workshop. The second advantage here is that you will also earn stars, which unlock equipment and XP for your squad in these Steam missions, and all of this compounds. It's a great way to just play some different maps and grind out some XP and stars for your squad to unlock things, which is something you should and will be doing anyways. The community and mod selection for Doorkickers 2 is crazy, and even better if you don't feel like browsing through the workshop for a map, there is a function in the game where you can just click random Steam Workshop map and the game will pick one, download it, and load it up for you. There's scenarios where there's 2-man teams all the way up to full-fledged 8 or 10-man teams in giant maps taking on a lot of enemy forces, which is great because obviously you're ranking up a lot of soldiers in your squad all at once. Tip number 4 is that your soldiers will each have individual random stats when they start out. For example, you can see that the marksmanship stat in my marksman varies widely. You may have noticed this already, but don't panic too much because in the long run, when you rank these soldiers up, you can max out all of these stats. However, when you're first starting out and early on, this can definitely affect that soldier's performance on the battlefield. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to banish those soldiers forever. Instead, play to their strengths in missions, or better yet, use the tools at your disposal to improve and put them in the best situation possible. Starting with tip number 5, your doctrines. These are upgrades to your squad as a whole and are easy to overlook early on when you're just experimenting and learning the game, but these will make a big difference. As your squad levels up, you will get doctrine points to put into these upgrades for things like close to medium range combat training, target transition time, faster reloads, and even learning some phrases in the local language to help with communication with civilians that are on the battlefield. There's no real reason to save these points up or anything like that, as you can invest them and get the immediate benefits fits for your squad. And that kind of ties right into the next tip, which is the equipment and stars system. Each mission that you successfully complete will give you a ranking of 1 to 3 stars, and those stars are kind of like the currency you will use to unlock better equipment for your squad. A couple of interesting points here. You should know that equipment unlocks do carry between squads, so if you have multiple ranger squads, you won't have to re-unlock any equipment for them. However, they do not carry between the different types of squads. When you eventually gain access to the SWAT and CIA, they have their own equipment, so you'll have to unlock that stuff specifically. However, the stars you accumulate do carry between the different types of squads, so you could, for example, grind with your rangers that are leveled up and use the stars that you earn to also unlock the SWAT or CIA equipment if you wanted to. It should also be noted that this does not apply to doctrines. Those are squad-specific upgrades, so if you start a new squad, even if it's the same type of squad, it will not have those doctrines. Now, before we get into the finer points of the gameplay that you need to understand, if this video has helped you at all, feel free to drop a like on it. I cover tactics and strategy gaming on the channel, so if you guys want more Doorkickers 2 content, let me know. The next tip is something I've seen a lot of players talk about or not realize, and that is crouching. You need to understand the crouch. Doorkickers 2 is not an FPS where you crouch walk around the entire game with your shotgun. If you crouch your soldiers, they will not shoot. Crouching has much more specific use cases in this game. For example, if you're in cover and taking fire, you can crouch down and it will generally protect your soldier more. You can also crouch under things like windows so you don't get seen and take unnecessary fire. Or you can get really creative with it. Have a soldier duck down in front of a door and open it so the man behind can provide cover, because you can open doors while crouched, and that applies to really any soldier in the line of fire for a friendly. If they crouch down, the friendly will be able to engage over top of them. And one big bonus tip here is that you can still use all of your throwables while you're crouched down, making it the perfect mechanic for if you're pinned down and taking fire, you can still throw grenades and flashbangs out at the enemy. And if you just listen to that whole section wondering, how do I crouch? This next tip might hit home for you. As a new player starting out, you really need to understand and look at the action wheel. It seems like a lot and maybe looks overwhelming at first, but really most of it is just simple actions. This is where you toggle your crouch, walking, running, things like that. Also, and more importantly, there are commands here available for your soldiers to do things like match their nearby allies' speed, stop and engage if they see any enemies, or keep walking, and go silent and only fire if spotted, which will give you the option to manually fire if you see an enemy but they don't see you. This is very helpful in some missions. Another overlooked action on this wheel is the reload, because combat reloads at the wrong time are absolutely deadly. From time to time, you should double check your soldiers' ammo, especially after a long engagement, and have them reload their mags before moving forward if necessary. This action wheel is also where you use go codes, which is how you synchronize actions between different soldiers in the squad. There is a tutorial mission in the FNGs welcome section that shows you how to utilize this a little bit, and again, I do recommend playing through those missions. And last but not least, something that took me way too long to realize I could do, you can open up the action wheel and use it to delete the entire path from that point forward, or just delete waypoints. And I swear I didn't realize I could do this for way too long, and I was just manually remaking the paths. Don't be like me. Understand the wheel. The next couple of tips are going to talk about the equipment and engagements, because the equipment is obviously also something you need to understand. Flashbangs are probably the most obvious for breaching and clearing, and of course you have the classic frag grenade if you want a little bit more fun or lethality. But the finer points, like using smoke grenades to cover your support gunners while they get into position to suppress an area, or just blowing through walls, will make all of the difference. Different optics, weapons, and armors all have distinct drawbacks or positives, and will directly affect things like aim speed and mobility. Knowing when, what, and how to use your equipment could really mean the difference between success or failure in some of these missions. Because of this, you should make sure that you use your early unlock points and stars for equipment carefully. Look at the things you want to unlock, maybe plan ahead a little bit. I almost always choose armor and suppressors first. And also make sure to double check all of your operators and the equipment they're bringing in, because things like night vision goggles, suppressors, extra equipment, and attachments are not equipped to all of those characters in that class at once. All of this to say, for the next tip, that the engagements and the equipment you're using for them really do matter. I've seen a decent amounts of discussions with new players complaining about soldiers staring at enemies or not being fast enough to react when engaged and dying. As mentioned in the previous tip, you really need to factor in the speed and mobility. Obviously, large hits to your mobility are going to cause some issues when you're in tight quarters with lots of enemies. You're going to lose some gunfights. Optics are another great example, as obviously if you go into a close quarters situation with a lot of soldiers decked out in long range optics, target acquisition will suffer. Your approach and the layout of the mission needs to be fitted to the equipment you are using. And another callback from a tip earlier, your doctrines play a huge part in this. Using doctrines, you can train your squad in long range or close quarters combat, and even do things like have them switch to burst when you're in close. And the more you level up and upgrade your squad with these things, the better they'll perform in all of these different scenarios. But again, I can't stress enough that just going with all of the heaviest armor and the hardest hitting, heaviest guns is not going to be the way that you win these missions. This is an army of two. This is supposed to be tactical, remember? But at the end of the day, that is my final tip. Just have fun, experiment, and learn. It's all a part of the process in Doorkickers too. You won't permanently lose soldiers if they die or you fail in a one-off single mission. So don't be afraid to engage, and don't be afraid to learn and test out different things and see how they work for you. However, if you go to the campaigns, it is a little bit of a different story with Iron Man and permadeath. Since you have to clear out 15 missions before you can even start that though, hopefully by then you won't be such a newbie and it won't be that big of a deal. Like I said before, I'm no expert myself, so let's get out there together and put some of these tips to good use. And if you're interested in more tactics and strategy gaming content, feel free to check out the channel.